Hey, hello, Earthlings. Welcome to a bit of a special, in the sense that this is it's kind of like a rerun of an interview that I did with Seb Alex. So I think about 2.5 weeks ago, Seb published on his channel this interview, and so he gave me permission to do it on mine as well. So this is what we're doing. I split it up into two parts as well. So that's what's kind of going on. In fact, I think we did the interview several weeks ago, but it was only being published about 2.5 weeks ago. So hello to Vegan Pundit and Deb. Hi, how are you doing? Just as people are coming in. Now, what I thought we'd do in terms of this is that I will be around within the chat during the actual interview, which is about 30 minutes long, and then if people want to comment, then if I can answer the comments during the show in another comment, I will. If I think it needs a response, we can wait to the end for that. So if you comment anyway, it will be held in the chat, as it were, and then we can proceed from there. Hopefully that will kind of make sense with a bit of luck. Okay, so this is our agenda. This is, as I said, part one. So we went through quite a lot of stuff in the full interview. So this is just kind of just over half of it, really. And so we started off with my vegan story, that type of thing. We talked about Tom Regan, of course. You wouldn't expect me not to, I guess. How the reaction to direct action has changed over time. We had a little look at that. The definition and scope of veganism, we touched on that issue. And then in terms of my own kind of history, we looked at the arrest and imprisonment issue that went on. The British Union of Fascists is an interesting part of all that. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Bulletproof cars and armed guards, that's also part of it as well. Mr. Vegan was my name when I was in prison. A strong sense of injustice. The practicalities of prisoners comes up. And I kind of give one example of that, which is quite interesting. And then this kind of weird idea that the Vegan Society, as the largest criminal organization in Britain, and of course we all knew that, really, didn't we? And then it ends with Seb Alex asked me about the hope of animal liberation, and again, was there more back then than there is now, kind of thing. So that's the kind of rundown, if you like. So okay, so we'll get on with it. As I said, I will respond to the comments as we're going, and also I'll pop on at the end just in case we've got anything to finish up with. So okay, folks, here we go.
Roger, thank you so much for making time for this. We've been going back and forth on recording an episode for a while now, so thank you so much for making time for it.
Well, thank you for thinking of me. I don't think we've seen each other since Dublin and the what was it? Meet the Victims, wasn't it? Was that the?
I believe so. It was a few years ago, at least.
It was, yeah.
3 or 4 years ago.
So how are you keeping, Seb?
I'm doing all right. How's everything going with you?
Not too bad, not too bad. I've got a sick cat with me at the moment, but which is a bit stressful, but plowing through, as you do.
Yeah. For the listeners who don't know who you are, can you please give us a short background of who you are and what you do and what you've done?
I mean, my story starts in 1977, when I tried to join the Hunt Saboteurs. I always call it a false start, for me. But I got involved with veganism and the movement in general in 1979. So that's 44 years ago. I got very involved with kind of single issues, a lot of action groups. This is the early 80s by now. But I was also a committee member for the BUAV, which was radical. That stands for the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. It's now Cruelty Free International. So it was a very kind of radical group at the time. And it injected a lot of money into the grassroots, and it was part of, there's a bit of a peak, I suppose, in the 80s. Animal aid in Britain had only been started in 77 by a woman called Jean Pink. And so everything was kind of going, at that time. So I got involved with a lot of action groups. And then I became the Northern Press Officer for the Animal Liberation Front, or more technically, the Animal Liberation Front Supporters Group, really. I did some press for that before I got arrested and stopped. And then in terms of academia, my MA was about the British animal movement. And then my PhD was about the support pillars of cultural speciesism. So we're looking at theology, philosophy, and everyday social practice. And of course, as a sociologist, I looked at the latter, really. So looked at things like children's books and, those kind of things. And then now I'm based in Dublin, and I'm a volunteer for a group called the Vegan Information Project. So we do weekly outreach events, and I'm doing quite a lot of stuff online. I got a show called Still Alive with Ronnie Lee, who's been vegan for 51 years. And that's why we call it that name. And I also do something called the Vegan Time Tunnel, looking back at the history of the movement or significant events, that kind of stuff.
Okay,
so that's
perfect.
me, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's safe to say we can technically do 10 episodes and still not be done with all the stories and insights you would have to share with us.
There's a few stories, yes. Hunt saboteurs, and I was part of the Sea Shepherd crew. So there's a few stories. Yeah.
Yeah. And what made you? So you went vegan in 77, right? What made you go vegan at the time?
I always trace it back to a sense when I was a child about fairness, about what was fair and what was not. And so it was some kind of innate kind of moral feeling, I think. But it was kind of out of focus, very abstract. It didn't really kind of put it into perspective until I read Tom Regan. And that's when I ended up with a philosophical understanding of my own kind of feelings, if you like. But I do remember being at school, letting wasps out, jumping from desk to desk, letting wasps out. Everyone else was trying to kill them. I was trying to let them go. There's a couple of instances where I think my overriding feeling was, well, is that fair or is that not? And I think now, of course, I would say, is that just? I think so. Yeah. I think it was something based on that, and then I got a firm philosophical grounding to it when I read Regan, as I said. So that was 83, and since then, I've been stuck in the groove, you might say.
And do you remember which book of Tom Regan was that you first read?
It was a case, actually. It was the case. I mean, I don't recommend that people go for the case for animal rights, but that was the only one at the time. So that was his first book, 1983. I always recommend that they go for Defending Animal Rights, which is 2001, because that's a set of journal articles, which means they've got a start, a beginning, and a middle for each chapter, and so it's easy to read. Yeah. There's also one called the Animal Rights Debate, which is pretty good, and another one called Animal Rights and Human Wrongs, which is sections from the case without it being the case.
Yeah.
There's a lot of problems with that book now, but they're bound to be. I know you're familiar with Regan's work, Seb, and I mean, it's quite dated now. But also another issue is the fact that he wrote it in a very conservative way, because back in the day, and he kind of started really late 70s, right? Back in the day, people used to laugh at the idea of animal rights and even the idea of animal liberation. And so it was seen as almost a denigration of human rights. And so there was an initial hurdle to overcome and say, well, look, give us a fair hearing here. And so they, Reagan kind of formed everything very conservatively, kind of a subject of a life, which is controversial concept of who qualifies, as it were, and this kind of stuff. So there are some problems on that text. At the same time, it's our foundational rights-based text, so it's still important in that sense.
Yeah, I actually just purchased 2 secondhand books, the Defending Animal Rights and which one is the second you mentioned? It's probably somewhere behind me. Defending Animal Rights. I've read Animal Rights and Human Wrongs. I found it much easier than the Case of Animal Rights.
Yeah, it is.
As you said, the Case for Animal Rights is quite a intense and heavy book to read. It's quite long as well. And
the 400 pages.
Yeah, the Animal Rights Debate. Is that the one that includes, I believe, Cohen and Singer and Gary Francione, or?
No, just Cohen. So it's Carl Cohen and Tom Regan. And then there's a separate book, which is Gary Francione and Robert Garner. So Singer's not involved with either of those.
All right. Okay, good thing. So from 77, you went vegan. 83, 84, you got familiar with the philosophy. How did you end up with being part of direct action groups?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, it was 79 I went vegan, actually. But yeah, what it was, back in 77, I read a music magazine, which is what got me initially involved, or at least I was hoping to, This is that false start that I talked about. And it was an article about anti-blood sports groups, one of which was the Hunt Saboteurs. And they weren't asking for money, they were asking for action. And that really kind of appealed to me. Not least because my sister, who's 8 years older than me, also a vegan, but she's now 73. But she used to do a lot of conservation work, and I used to remember the mantelpiece with the, the kind of the lion appeal, the elephant appeal, this kind of stuff. And there was also a financial scandal involving the RSPCA. And so I was thinking, how much of your donations are getting through, and so I got a little bit cynical of the corporate side of things.
Yeah.
And here was a group asking for action and not money. And so that appealed for me. And so I got involved with all of that. And then the Northern Animal Liberation League, and then the Animal Liberation Front, and, all the kind of various things, hair coursing, grouse shooting, all of the kind of direct action against all of that kind of stuff.
Okay. And would you say that what society reacted with, like the reaction that you had back in the day, is similar to how society reacts nowadays towards veganism and animal rights?
That's actually a complicated question, just because it changed over time, in the sense that in the early days, the press was quite positive. It was almost like animal freedom fighters, that kind of stuff. And particularly if you take the case of the Animal Liberation Front, for example, when they liberated other animals from laboratories, especially if those individuals were, for example, beagles, that was very popular with both the public and the press. What really happened was a movement issue where the homes for these liberated other animals started to dry up. And so the activists turned to their second kind of strategy, which was economic sabotage, they call it, which is a name for meaning damage, that kind of thing. And once they started doing more damage and they had less cuddly pictures to show, then the press kind of changed. So I think it depends on which kind of era we're talking about. And then it also depends on which kind of modern day activism that you're talking about as well, because there are some kind of fluffy types and there are some more militant types. The difference now is that we've got social media commentary on what's going on now, which obviously was completely absent. It was the mass media only in those days. And the weird thing is that we didn't really care much about the public in those days. We didn't see ourselves as engaging the public. It's one of the most fascinating things I try to explain to relatively new vegans, that we were vegan back then, but we didn't campaign for veganism. We campaigned on single issues, and we very rarely mentioned veganism, even though most of us were vegans as individuals. In fact, even the vegan society back in those days wasn't really seen as part of the animal rights movement. And yet there was a load of animal welfare corporations that were. So I've always described our movement as a little bit messy, philosophical mess, but in terms of the press that we get, I think it depends what it was back then and even now as well.
Okay. And would you say the single issue that you were doing at the time, would you now see that there was anything wrong with that?
Yes, very much. It was to do with the claims that we made about it. And so we would have been able to kind of what you might call abolitionize them if our claims was right, because there's no such thing as an animal welfare event or a single issue event, really. It depends on what you say about them. That's the issue. And so we were pretty bad in terms of our claims making back then. We didn't, as I said, we didn't really appeal to the public. We didn't have a live vegan, be vegan message, anything like that. We didn't talk about what individuals could do to end animal exploitation and oppression. We were just looking for enemies to fight. And I've always said that the big difference now is that we've stopped looking for enemies to fight, or most of us have, and we're now looking for people to educate. And that seems to be a big difference. There are people, of course, who think that we should begin a lot more of these kind of pressure campaigns. But even now, in this day and age, that would incorporate vegan education. Now, that bit was absent back then, and that was a complete failing on our part. I mean, I know that for one of these points and myself, if we both could go back, that was the main thing we'd change. We would start vegan education much earlier, and we'd incorporate it with everything else that we do as it is now. See, what we've got now is relatively new. Vegan education as we know it is a 21st century phenomena. Some people say, we've been doing this for decades, it's not worked. That's actually not factually true. I mean, it only started gearing up in the mid-90s and then got going, like 10 years later. There was still a lot of reluctance to it. There are still people even now in the movement that think veganism is a scare word. And so they would advise people not to use it or to go easy on it, even though you might see all the supermarkets full of the word vegan, on products, for example. And so I think the grassroots and the supermarkets, funny enough, for this kind of weird alliance, had to prove to the corporate side that veganism wasn't such a scare word. But that's only happened the last 10 years or so.
Wow, interesting. And talking about veganism, how do you define veganism? Do you agree with the definition that the Vegan Society offers?
Oh, I don't like it too much, although it kind of covers everything in a fairly moderate sense. I always go back to the people who started the vegan social movement, and I also have the caveat that I'm not saying that these are the first people to either eat plant-based or to care about other animals, but they were, as far as we know, the first people to come together to actually deliberately make a social movement. And they also named it veganism. And so they stand out for that reason alone, really. So I go back to some of the things that they said. For example, that it's about the opposition to the exploitation of sentient life. That was said in 1945. So it was an expansive, justice-based idea. And I think the way to get your head around that, if you like, is to remember when it was formed. It was formed in the last years of the so-called Second World War, right? And so this global conflict was still happening. And so they saw veganism as part of the peace movement. They saw it as part of nonviolence. They even used phrases like peace aims. And so I summarize it really as a justice for all movement. They thought that veganism was part of the moral evolution of humanity. They thought that see, another thing we've really got to do. Even my generation, who wasn't in the war, and certainly yours, Seb, is the fact that they lived through 2 world wars. These people, and Donald Watson said it was an absolutely shattering experience. He was a conscientious objector. He refused to fight. He said he wouldn't kill anyone, whether they were human or not. And so he was punished for that, as they were in those days, you know. But it was right there. They were learning about the Holocaust. Still yet to find out about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ironically, but they were learning about things like the Holocaust. And this news for them right there on the spot, you know, happening right there, was a real shock to them. Now, for us, it's just something that you read in books and see in movies even.
Yeah.
Right? And so I don't think we understand the visceral nature of what it was like. And so they did really see veganism as getting us out of a moral trough.
All right.
And they said time and time again, I mean, Watson said that veganism was the only movement that can save humanity. They made massive claims like that. Kathleen Janaway, one of the pioneers, she said that if we can solve the problem of veganism, it will solve the problem of poverty and war. That they thought about veganism as a really massive idea.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has gone now from the movement, that this kind of huge kind of idea that if vegan values came in, it would be absolutely amazing world. Watson said that if the vegan ideal came in, it would be the biggest peaceful revolution in the history of humanity. You know, that's the kind of claims they made about it, you know?
That's really, I mean, yeah, it's powerful. And I do think that if we want to really get rid of all discrimination, exploitation, then we should start at the root, which is, in my opinion, speciesism, because it's one of the first, if not the first type of discrimination that you learn, the idea that this individual looks different or thinks different, therefore you have a certain right over them. I mean, that's the basis of discrimination. Yeah,
I agree with that. And of course, I think that now things are kind of, if you like, split up into causes. And the vegan cause has got a focus and a scope. It'd be great for all causes to have a focus and a scope. And so, you know, anti-racist campaigners wouldn't do anything anti-speciesist. Anti-speciesist campaigners wouldn't do anything anti-racist, and so forth. Neither would do anything that would damage the interests of women. And so, if you know, I mean, our moral obligation to others is not to kind of mess around with their campaign in a negative way. Even if that's not our campaign, we can see it as aligned to what we're doing, in the sense that it's all about justice.
Yeah.
If we're all moving towards justice, but our focuses are different, but our scopes are the same, that would be a massive improvement for what's going on right now. And that means then that we as vegans can challenge other movements and say, what about speciesism? As they can challenge us and say, what about sexism in your movement? What about racism? What about the rise of right-wing influences in your movement? Is this a problem? And you know, those are legitimate questions from a justice-based position.
Okay. And can you talk a bit to us to what led to your arrest and how that happened and what did it result to?
Yeah, well, ultimately, I ended up serving 4 years. Well, I was charged with 3 things. Conspiracy to cause arson, I was acquitted of that. And then conspiracy to cause criminal damage, and conspiracy to incite others to cause criminal damage. Now, I've always said that really I was innocent of the first 2 and semi-guilty of the third one, in the sense that I was seen as not as an activist, but as a spokesperson.
Okay.
But in the end, and you can see this reflected in Ronnie Lee's 10-year sentence, what the state wanted to do was to shut us up more than anything. In fact, they gave the largest sentences to the people who spoke about what we were doing rather than did what we were about, you know. And so it was the fact that I think that we were starting to become quite influential in terms of the rest of the movement looking at what we were doing. we were building a kind of mass movement of direct action, I suppose, and that eventually the state kind of goes, okay, well, we've had enough of these people, and we're going to clamp down, and that's what they did. I mean, one of the things that really rankles with me more than anything is that the judge who sent me to prison stood for Parliament for the British Union of Fascists, and that always niggles with me, right?
Oh.
He's called Sir Frederick Lawton. They brought him out of retirement to do our case. He would arrive at court in Sheffield, in Yorkshire, every day in a bulletproof car, right? And he had two heavies with guns stood next to him in the dock, and so it was very, you know, I was thinking, well, you know, this guy, you know, do you stand for justice and non-violence like I do, you know? But you've got the power to send me away, and I always found that really difficult to accept, to be honest, as you would.
Wow. And did you spend time in prison?
Oh yeah, I altogether it was 2 years and something of it. So the sentence was 4, but the worst part, to be honest, is when I was in remand, because I had to share a cell with Ronnie Lee. That was the worst part. So, Seb, you know, so. but then I actually I had such a sense of injustice that I actually went on the run. I you know, I kind of absconded from court. I had such a kind of like, you know, I was almost like saying to the police officers, you know, kind of, you know, not face to face. I was saying, well, you know, you don't know me, you don't know anything about me, and yet you'll be violent towards me on the say so of a fascist, and this can't be right, you know, and it just seemed so, everything was so wrong about it, and so I ended up doing my sentence a little later than everybody else. It would have been easier to have done my sentence with everybody else. I'm sure it gone through a lot quicker. So, but I was kind of on my own. It was interesting because in my prison they called me Mr. Vegan, and I became known as that, you know, kind of odd bod, you know, because of course the system wouldn't see our crime as political, but the other cons they did, because they would say, well, how much did you get paid to do that? And you go, well, you didn't get paid. And of course, they wouldn't get out of bed without getting paid, right? And so they were going, why is that?
Would
you
you?
Also, they were incredibly practical people. For example, we would talk about our anti-vivisection campaigning, and they go, oh, well, it's easy to stop that. What you do is you grab them, you tie them to a tree, and you break their hands with baseball bats, and they'll never do it again. They had this really kind of practical solution, and we're kind of going, no, you can't do that. You know, that's violent.
Yeah.
And so us, the terrorists, were, it was so weird, you know.
And were you able to follow a plant-exclusive diet in prison, or was that just impossible at the time?
Yes, in the day, you had actually to be an official member of the Vegan Society. So the vegetarian diet was always established already, and in fact, it was called a special diet. And a lot of the ordinary cons would switch to a vegetarian diet when they go into prison, even though they weren't vegetarian, on the grounds that it was known to be better than the standard diet. Wow. But in terms of veganism, you had to actually produce, the Vegan Society had this little kind of deep red membership card. And we asked the Vegan Society, when people get arrested and put away, can you just send them a card and we'll send you the money afterwards, kind of thing. And they said no to that, wow. which was a real shock. And so we thought, okay, so we just forged their membership card and just sent them to people anyway. and then Ronnie was saying that a lot of people were influenced to kind of go vegan because of him in prison, and so in the end, he always claims that the Vegan Society was a large criminal organization in Britain for a time, because suddenly you got all these people committing these terrible crimes becoming members in order to get the vegan diet, you know.
Wow.
It's all a bit weird. I don't think you have to do that now. I think you just state it now, I think, rather than having to prove it, as it were. I mean, it was a torturous thing, because in my prison you used to have to make an application in order to make an application. So everything in prison is slow. People move slow. You slouch around. You walk around slow and all that, and everything is slow. And so to get anything done is almost a nightmare. It just kind of slows everything down, which in a weird way kind of helps people deal with their time, I suppose.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, was there any time during those years that the movement had a lot of hope that, hey, this is actually working? We might get animal liberation eventually. Did that exist, or it was out of
Yes,
question?
absolutely. In fact, going back to my time at the BYV, I distinctly remember someone who I still know on Facebook, someone who was working there, I think semi-volunteer. There were a lot of volunteers working because it was the radicalization of the BYV at the time. And she said to us, "Do you know what? We'll have won in 10 years." And everything was so, everything was so kind of dramatic and dynamic at the time that none of us thought that was a ridiculous thing to say. That 10 years was no way that 10 years as a timeline is going to work. We thought, yeah, you're right, because there was a really big upswing in terms of press interest, in terms of people joining. I mean, you get 12,000 people at anti-vivisection march and stuff like that. And if the march ended up at a laboratory, which they often did, the place would get stormed. I mean, it was. I think the people in the movement were more political then. It was more militant then, and so we did things routinely, which probably would be a bit shocking now, in the sense that there was a lot of mass trespassers. There was a lot of things going on, a lot of damage that was done. Other groups just specialized in getting information, but they would do it on a mass scale, take hundreds of people into a place. And the basis for that was that if you're an activist and you go into, for example, a battery unit, you'll never forget that experience because of the heat, the noise, and the smell of the place. You'll never, ever forget it, And so it was educational for the activists as much as anyone else. And so that meant that, when the farmers do their usual thing, oh, we've got the best welfare in the world, all this kind of stuff, which all farmers everywhere in the world say that, right? But it just doesn't wash. If you've been in one of these places, you think, no way, mate. I've seen it, I've smelt it, I've kind of touched it, and there's no way you fall for all that. And so there was a lot of that kind of thing going on because it was pre-internet. And so we had to spread information around in different ways then.
Yeah. And can you quickly give a detail about what a battery unit is for listeners who are not aware of these terms?
Yeah, it's one of the intensive types of units for so-called layer chickens. And so in those days, it used to be 7 or 8 chickens put into small cages. So they would have, each individual would have the size of something, well, a bit less than an A4 sheet of paper. Wow. And so then you'd get a lot of feather pecking, and you get a lot of, a lot of mortality. The ones who died, sadly, would then get trampled by the others, because it was a very chaotic kind of situation. I mean, we used to hire these big video cameras and pretend to be the press to get into these kind of things, but the things that you see are really terrible because they're cramped together. It's almost like having 3 people in a phone box. People remember what phone boxes are. And so people start fighting, and the chickens start fighting. And so the solution from a species point of view is more violence. And so, well, if they're going to fight, let's chop off their weaponry. So we chop off their beaks, or the tips of their beaks. Pigs, when they're in intensive situations, they tend to do a lot of tail biting. So they remove the teeth and then remove the tails. So we often respond with violence. And that's one of the things that animal rights would do for the world, that we would approach other animals as fellow rights bearers. And once we did that in anything, rogue elephants, rogue fox, or whatever you want to say, crop deaths, you would approach the situation that we were amongst other rights bearers. Now, how do we approach the situation now? Whereas obviously what happens right now is that we just reach for the gun, we reach for the poison. All that would go in a vegan world. And so again, going back to the massiveness of veganism, it would change the world literally if the vegan ideal became widespread.
Yeah.
Okay, folks. So that's your part one. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'm not quite sure when part two will be as yet. It might even be Friday, but if not, possibly just a week from now. It's a little bit shorter. In fact, this is the rundown for that. A little bit shorter, but yeah. So there's been no new comments and everything for a while, and I think we dealt with just about everything. So I shall say good night to everyone, and thanks again for watching. And yeah, thank you, Deb. Part two will be winging its way when we can. As I said, well, I can't remember what I was saying actually, but anyway, yeah. So part two is on its way, and yeah, I'll see you soon with that. We've got another special time tunnel interview tomorrow with quite an interesting person who went vegan in 1986. So that's quite interesting, called Tony Martin. So we've got lots and lots of pictures and a couple of interesting videos. He's a fire breather and a juggler, worked at a kind of non-animal circus, this kind of stuff. So that's all pretty interesting stuff. So see you soon for part two, and I'll see you tomorrow probably for the time tunnel.